Okay, so in today's class, I'm going to be having a look at another C2 writing task. It's an essay about youth culture. So let's have a look at the task first of all. So it says writing part 1, read the two texts, write an essay summarising and evaluating the key points from both texts, use your own words throughout as far as possible, and include your own ideas in your answer. So let's have a look at the two texts they're talking about. Text 1, the birth of youth culture. In the early 1960s, a new wave of romantic enthusiasm and innovation, political, spiritual, and cultural, or rather countercultural, broke over the Western world. At first, only a few social and aesthetic radicals were involved in what presently came to be called the youth culture. The majority of right-thinking persons were offended or bored by the new music, the new art, and the new politics, but a shrewd student of fashion observing what was being worn on the streets of Europe and America might have predicted that in a few years youth would be adored and emulated everywhere. That, indeed, simply to be under 30 would be accounted a virtue. Let's take a look at the second text then. Here we are. Text 2. What is youth culture? It has been argued that the youth culture that began in the 1960s was the product of manipulation of impressionable young people by commercial interests, that youth culture is really no more than the range of products available specifically for the young. Others have tried to explain youth subcultures, not in terms of mindless consumption, but in terms of genuine style innovation, and the generation of styles which say something about the social and economic conditions in which those young people live, their experiences, and their aspirations. So did you get all of that? Good. Let's have a look at the example answer and let's see if A, they've answered the question well and it's understandable, and B, the more technical sort of grammatical errors and stuff. Let's have a look. So let's read the introduction. The term youth culture was first coined in the 1960s. Apparently, youth culture meant revolt against old, rigid traditions. Had these brave young people not revolted against the obsolete system, we would have not experienced certain issues. Or, if these brave young people had not rioted against the obsolete system, such as freedom and tolerance and sexual and racial equality in a different light. Okay. Both these texts outline this idea in relation to style and innovation. So I think the introduction is good, all of course, except that penultimate sentence there, which is a bit confusing. So obviously I think we have to bear in mind that this is an essay that was intended to be corrected. So we have this parenthesis here, this alternative phrase, alternative sentence in brackets, which is a bit confusing, but it's a good start. The term youth culture was first coined in the 1960s, no problems. Apparently youth culture meant revolt against old rigid traditions. Good, again. Maybe it meant revolting or rebelling against, but yeah, I think that's absolutely fine. A revolt is a noun. It meant revolt against old rigid traditions, no problems. Here's where it's a little bit confusing. Had these brave young people not revolted against the obsolete system, we would have not experienced... so here we have the first small error. It says we would have not experienced. I think it's better to say we would not have. No, we wouldn't have experienced certain issues. Okay. We wouldn't have experienced certain issues. And then we're just going to ignore what is after the comma here, because this is just an alternative way of saying what he has just said. So we're just going to ignore that up until the end of the brackets. That's just him suggesting another way of saying it. I think the way he has said it is. Okay. So we would not have experienced certain issues such as freedom and tolerance, sexual and racial equality, in a different light. So I think what he's saying is that the revolution helped us to see these issues in a different light. So maybe what we should say here is we would not have seen certain issues such as freedom and tolerance, sexual and racial equality in a different light. So this revolution sort of helped society to see these issues in a different light, I think is the correct expression here. Both texts outline this idea in relation to style and innovation. Yeah, I think that's fine now. Okay, so moving on, let's have a look at the next paragraph. The author of the first text tells us about the story of how youth culture began. When you are young, the whole world is your oyster. Most of the time is young people who come up with new ideas, whether these are awful or awesome. Some of the radical young people, fed up with the current regulations, the many ways of appalling discriminations, the horrible, meaningless wars, high expectations of their parents, and questioned the traditional value of contemporary society. These times, older people tend to smother younger people's voices of dissent. Therefore, eventually, they did the daring step in order to stand out of the crowd and swim against the tide in the 1960s. Okay, so this paragraph starts well. The author of the first text tells us about the story of how youth culture began. Good, perfect. Okay, first small error here. When you are young, the whole world is your oyster. Most of the time is young people. So I think we should say it is young people who come up with new ideas, whether these are awful or awesome. Good play on words there with the antonyms, awful and awesome. So, okay, not too bad there. Some of the radical young people fed up with the current regulations. This is a bit of a problem because the current regulations, I think what it becomes clear as we read on in the paragraph that he's actually talking about a period in time in the past. He's talking about the 1960s, the birth of youth culture. So it's certainly not current regulations. It might have been the regulations of the time. So some radical young people fed up with the regulations of the day, the many ways of appalling discriminations, perhaps the many types of appalling discrimination, the horrible, meaningless wars, good. And then I think this is just another thing, so I don't know why there's a semicolon. The high expectations of their parents, and questioned the traditional value of contemporary society. Well, that sounds like you're finishing the list of things that they were fed up with. So I think the problem here is that we're missing a word from the sentence. Some of the radical young people were fed up with the regulations of the time, the many types of appalling discrimination, the horrible, meaningless wars, comma, not semicolon, the high expectations of their parents. So they were fed up with all of these things, and they questioned the traditional value, or I think probably values, of contemporary society. Okay, so that was a long sentence, and if you've got a very long sentence and 2 or 3 errors, it can get very confusing. It's often better to be concise and precise, and that makes it a lot easier to understand what you're trying to say exactly, because a couple of small errors in that sentence made it very difficult to understand. Okay, and these times older people tend to smother young people's voices of dissent. So again, problem with the time here. I think we're talking about back in the 1960s. So I think what we should say here is, in those times, older people tended to smother young people's voices of dissent. I mean, some really good language in here, just these small errors making it just sound a lot worse than it actually is. Certainly in a conversation, this would sound fantastic. In terms of spoken English, this would be very high-level stuff, but these small errors when you're writing can make all the difference. Therefore, eventually they did the daring step. Well, I think they took the daring step. You take a step. They took the daring step. And then I think they've gone a bit overboard here with the two expressions, one after the other. Now they took the daring step of in order to stand out of the crowd and swim against the tide in the 1960s. Well, what did they do exactly? He goes on to explain it, but they took the daring step in order to stand out of the crowd and swim against the tide in the 1960s. That's sort of three figurative expressions there that actually confuse us more than they inform us. So even though there's not too many errors in that sentence, grammatically speaking, it's just a little bit confusing. Okay, let's move on. Let's find out what these young people did. They established outrageous fashion, launched peaceful anti-war campaigns with millions of crowd against the government, created novel music styles such as rock and roll, which jolted the standing water of society. The rock concerts provided an experience, the sense of belonging for them. These rebellious acts were usually frowned upon by the vast majority of people, especially the older generation. These daredevil pioneers had not envisaged that their way of living will be followed by contemporary young people in every corner of the world by a few years later. Okay, so let's go back and have a look then. It says, they established outrageous fashion, launched peaceful anti-war campaigns with millions of crowd against the governments. So I think what that should say is crowds of millions against the governments, or millions of crowds. I think crowds of millions would be the best. Crowds made up of millions of people against the governments, created novel music styles such as rock and roll, so here's a little bit of a problem here. It says, which jolted the standing water of society. So I can't really think of an exact expression here that is getting that the writer is getting confused with here, but clearly, I mean, jolting the standing water, we don't say that. What we could say possibly, which would make sense, I think, is which stirred the still waters of society. Yeah, I think that would make sense, to stir the still waters of society. Yeah, so we have water which is still and calm and conservative in society, figuratively speaking, and you stir water, no, to make it more chaotic, I suppose. The rock concerts provided an experience, the sense of belonging for them. So I think what he means to say here is the rock concerts provided a sense of belonging for them. No? The rock concerts provided maybe an experience of a sense of belonging, but I think the simplest way is, yeah, a sense essentially is an experience of something, no? So yeah, the rock concerts provided a sense of belonging for them. I think that's enough. These rebellious acts were usually frowned upon by the vast majority of people, okay, especially the older generation. These daredevil pioneers had not envisaged that their way of living would be followed by contemporary young people in every corner of the world within a few years. No, by a few years later, no. You say by a certain time in the future, but no, I think what we want to say is within a few years of this happening. No? So within a few years. Okay, so let's move on to the next paragraph then. The second text argues about what have triggered youth culture and explain thoroughly how it appeared in the market. Well, okay, a couple of things there in that first sentence. The second text argues about what triggered youth culture. I think the have there is unnecessary. What triggered youth culture back then, and explains, third person, thoroughly how it I think how it appeared on the market. Okay, so just a couple of grammatical problems there in that first sentence. Many of us associate the worn-out jeans, rock music, and long hair with youth culture. Good. This kind of lifestyle has permeated our lives. Yeah, another good sentence. Today, teenagers still imitate their predecessors. As the big company leaders realized how to take advantage of the growing demand, they immediately jumped on the youth culture bandwagon and made a tremendous amount of profit. I think, again, a really good sentence there. I can't really see any problems with it either. No big problems, at least. It goes without saying that this kind of mindless consumption was not intended in the 1960s among rebellious teenagers. And then in brackets, an alternative, or was not in their intention. I think was not intended in the 1960s, maybe by rebellious teenagers. Again, it sounds a bit clumsy, the end to that sentence. I think I would say something like this kind of mindless consumption was not what the rebellious teenagers of the 1960s had intended. Just sort of rolls off the tongue a bit better. Good, so let's have a look at the conclusion then. In conclusion, youth culture is a term which initially set out in the 1960s. Well, I think what is meant here is which initially came about or emerged in the 1960s. I think that would sound better. These teenagers from the past sent crystal clear messages for us, despite the social and economical situation. The socio-economic situation maybe sounds better, or the social and economic situation. We can forsake the beaten track and find our own way, not their own way. We can find our own way, and we can make a difference. Well, if anyone wants to give it a rating, give this writing a score out of 5 in the different competencies, then they can. I'm not going to do that in this video. I'll just make a general comment that, again, there are small errors in the essay. I thought it was quite good, though. I thought there was some really good use of language. And again, there's this difference between writing and speaking that is a big problem for a lot of people. That and it is definitely the case in with this person, that they can express themselves very well when they're speaking, but precision is really important when you're writing, because you won't get the same problems in understanding when you're speaking and someone's actively trying to understand you by looking at your facial expressions and body language and putting things into context. They're going to skip over the small grammatical errors that can absolutely confuse completely confuse someone when they're reading a text. So I think it's important to be as precise and concise as you can when you're writing. A lot of the time, a shorter sentence is better than a longer one, so long as it's completely accurate. But I'll leave the scoring down to someone else. It's not my favorite thing. Bye.